Hello, everybody. Welcome today. Delighted to welcome you to the Long Room Hub and to the first event from Human Plus, Human-Centric Approaches to Technology. Delighted today to kick off the Tech Talk series. Today, what we thought we would do is have 3 presentations around the particular topic of ethics and the ethical dimension in human-centric AI. You're all really welcome today. We're working in hybrid mode. So here today we have, as a collaborative group, we're here in the Long Room Hub, but also online we have many guests joining us, and you're very welcome. Just a little bit about the Human Plus program. It's pioneering in the sense that co-funded on the European Commission's Mary Sadowski-Curie actions, it's one of the first to really combine humanities and technology, where it's truly interdisciplinary, where we're funding research fellows to tackle the deep challenges between marrying the humanities perspective and the technological perspective. And every one of the fellows has supporting them multiple mentors from both sides of the disciplines to really enable them to make impact. And it's really focusing in on looking at these fundamental challenges as we look at the technologies of the future. And I'm delighted to welcome 4 of our 5 fellows here today for the discussion afterwards. And as I said, the plan is that we will have multiple of these tech talks between now and Christmas, really exploring specific issues. But today we wanted to keep it a little bit broader and discuss more the ethical dimensions of human-centric AI. We have 3 speakers today. Professor Linda Hogan is the Chair of Economics in the School of Religion, Theology and Peace Studies. We've got Professor Adam Henschke from Philosophy from the University of Twente. And we have Professor Dave Lewis from Computer Science Department, Trinity College Dublin, and from the ADAPT Centre. I'm Professor Vincent Wade. I'm the Chair of Computer Science, but I'm also one of the directors of the Human Plus programme, along with Professor Jane Allmar, who will be joining us later. So just for introduction, just kind of set the context, people are very familiar with the notion of human-centric or AI, but the human-centric AI aspect has become really important in the last 3 or 4 years. So if we look at what we mean by human-centric AI, if we think about it before, a lot of AI was talking about replacement of humans or automation. And really, what we've begun to look at AI is in a new way, is saying, well, actually, it really should be focusing in on empowering individuals, empowering the humans and society to engage in those digital experiences. And what that means is that all the potentials and capabilities of things like text analysis, natural language understanding, speech analysis, image, video, VR, virtual reality, and augmented reality, and robotics. That whole milieu of different technologies, which are all being driven by machine learning, driven by AI, really, rather than the human being some sort of element in the center of that, should actually be a participant and perhaps a peer or in control of the whole thing. And we want to look at those kind of roles that we see humans in the future. Because we must have control of it to feel part of it rather than be controlled completely, which should be inclusive. And we have to address the issues around accountability. So what we're looking at today is the ethical dimension of that. And as in the talks later on in the series, we look at different aspects of what we think about human-centric AI. So first, if I may introduce Professor Linda Hogan to talk a little bit about the ethical dimension. So Linda's going to be passed across the laptop in a second.
Thank you very much, Vinny. And while our slides are loading there, I just want to say what a pleasure it is to be part of this discussion with the Human Plus Fellows and colleagues who are interested in the ethical dimensions of human-centric AI, and also all of those who are joining us online. So, I should just. Oh yeah, here sorry, I have it. I'm sorry. Thank you. Yes. So. Just to begin by saying that the focus for the first decade of this discussion about human-centric or ethical AI really was about identifying the threats and the challenges associated with AI from an ethical perspective. So discussions and concerns about discrimination and bias, the issue of the end to privacy and all of these issues. And one of the interesting things for me as I started to reflect on this particular session was to recognize that actually we are and have been discussing this for almost a decade now. So identifying the threats and challenges, and there have been many, articulating the values that should be encoded in AI design, and I'll talk a little about that, and I know that Adam will as well. We've also focused on developing some tools like the ethics canvas that we developed in the Adapt Centre led by Dave, which is a tool whereby designers can begin to use value-sensitive design in their technology development. So tools that were specifically for those involved in technology development, and also establishing and adopting national and international standards and frameworks for trustworthy or ethical AI, and also professional engineering standards, which the IEEE and etc. So that has been the focus of the first decade. In this context, of course, the EU has been very important and to the fore. First, with the European Commission's 2018 communication that said that it would establish a commitment to ensure that an appropriate ethical and legal framework for AI would be the fundamental starting point or orientation for AI as it was developed and deployed in the European Union. And then in 2018 also it established the high-level expert working group on AI, although the European Ethics Group had been working on that issue a little beforehand. Then, of course, we've had the 2019 ethical guidelines for trustworthy AI, a standard setting, European and internationally. In 2021, the regulation establishing the harmonized rules for AI, those much more detailed, addressing the risk of specific uses of AI, identifying areas in the EU that the European Commission regarded as areas of unacceptable risk for AI development and deployment, high risk, limited risk, and minimal risk. And of course now, and I'm sure, I think Dave will probably discuss a little of this, we've got the ongoing work whereby the proposed AI Act is going through the processes of the Commission. In addition, and in parallel, we have a large number of national AI strategies as well. 24 different European countries have national AI strategies that reference ethical and human rights standards. Canada has, as many of you will know, a highly developed national AI strategy with a very strong ethical orientation, as do Argentina, Uruguay, Colombia, all referencing human rights standards. The Australian Human Rights Commission has worked a lot on ethical AI, and the US government under President Obama and President Trump have developed plans, I suppose, rather than strategies that focus on ethics and human rights in the AI sphere. And countries in the Indo-Pacific region focus as much on human-centered approaches to AI and highlight some of the ethical challenges and making AI work for humans. So again, this commitment to human-centric AI. And in addition to the European context, at the international level, there are complementary international initiatives, including those led by the UN. Most recently, the UN Human Rights Council has developed a core group that is focused on the human rights impacts of AI and new technologies, and advocates a human rights-based approach to AI. I think significantly, the 2018, the OECD expert group was established on AI in society, But the OECD 2019 principles on AI, I think, are very important. And that's what you see there on the screen, because they've also adopted the narrative of ethical and trustworthy approaches to AI that respect human rights and democratic values. And very important because of the inclusion of China in that declaration, although there were some modifications in the text that China adopted. And then most recently, the 2021 UNESCO recommendations on the ethics of artificial intelligence, which was adopted by 193 members of UNESCO and the associate members as well. And I'll talk a little about that just at the very end. The point is, I suppose, that we have a plethora now of frameworks, values and principles to guide ethical AI. And when you drill down among all of them, there is actually also a remarkable consensus about what the values that should guide AI development and the principles that should orient and manage the deployment of AI. The values: human dignity, freedom or autonomy, which includes specific freedoms, equality, human rights, and shared benefit or solidarity is the EU phrase that is equivalent to shared benefit, although it's obviously not identical. And these are made specific, more specific rather, through guiding principles of, and I'm taking this from the EU document, but it's actually very similar in other frameworks as well, made specific for AI development through commitment to human agency and oversight, very important, technical robustness and safety, privacy and data governance, transparency, diversity, non-discrimination and fairness, societal and environmental well-being and accountability. But what does this mean? Where do we go from here? 10 years has got us to this, and I think it's a remarkable achievement. We've got a significant alignment of values, multiple frameworks, and still a very significant sort of gap between the kind of implementation of AI, ethical AI in development, and probably more in deployment rather than development, but that's something that we can discuss. And also a very significant gap in terms of the population's confidence in the trustworthiness of the deployment of AI. So where do we go from here? And how can these ethical frameworks be translated into meaningful standards for design and regulation? I'm going to go a little more quickly now because there are just a couple of points that I want to make. Actually, I think that human rights, the evolution of human rights discourse is very instructive here. And I'm talking here about proposing, I suppose, that we think about human rights as a model. Why do I say that? Well, although we tend nowadays to focus on the legal dimensions of human rights norms, in fact, human rights is both a moral or ethical language and a legal language. It's actually, the foundation of human rights law is in an ethical discourse, that set of ethical values and moral claims. I'm not going to trace the history of it now and bore everybody, but I'd be happy to at another stage. But one can see this. It began with a kind of conviction about human equality and dignity, then became more elaborate and developed, I suppose, into concepts of civil and political rights, first of all, and then economic, social and cultural rights. But I want to suggest that it's this dual orientation as a moral and a legal language that's where much of its potency lies. And I think the core of this moral claim, equal dignity, each person counts for one, no person counts for more than one, from which flow freedoms, protections, and entitlements, which are then given elaboration and legal force through intersecting, overlapping national, regional, and international treaties and frameworks. The benefits, I think, are, very briefly, it puts the person, that is the individual, right at the center of assessments of AI. So it rules out kind of trade-offs that allow fundamental elements of human dignity to be overstepped. Secondly, it outlines duties of governments and responsibilities of other actors, including businesses, not only in protecting and respecting human rights, but also in providing effective remedies against violations. Thirdly, it rests on a broad global consensus that's understood to be universally applicable. It's got substantive and procedural elements, and human rights are understood as interdependent, indivisible, and inherent. And it strikes me that a great deal of this is highly relevant for the next step for human-centric AI. The Global Digital Policy Incubator at Stanford has begun in very recent years to focus on the benefits of an explicitly human rights-based approach to AI ethics. And I think, well, I suppose aligning with other work that I do, it seems to me that it's an important move. So to conclude, in my opinion, human rights-based and rights-respecting models of ethics could have real value in actually accelerating the pace of development of ethical AI. I end here with this reference to the UNESCO negotiations, because I was lucky enough to be involved with Barry O'Sullivan in these negotiations on behalf of the Irish government. And one of the, so we created a set of recommendations that 193 countries could buy into. They were complex and difficult, but what they showed was that there were multiple worldviews, countries with multiple worldviews, pluralist, explicitly secular, explicitly religious, could cohere around these. Those with different political arrangements and levels of political freedom, with the conviction and the aim and the determination to provide a universal framework of values and principles. And the first named value in that is respect, protection, and promotion of human rights. So, to conclude, we already have broad agreement on values and principles. We already have frameworks, including the International Human Rights Legal Framework, which establishes responsibilities of state and non-state actors. So let's just use them to implement human-centric ethical AI. Thank you.
Thank you. We think which best is we have the three presentation, then we open up to the floor. So Adam, could I introduce you and ask you to
Thanks very much. Can you hear me?
Perfectly, yes.
Excellent. So yeah, thanks very much for the invitation, and obviously thanks as well for people for listening. Hopefully you'll listen through my whole talk. My name's Adam Henschke. As mentioned, I'm with the philosophy section at the University of Twente in the Netherlands. I'm not very Dutch. I'm Australian with a German name, so a little bit confused on a range of levels. I'm also someone who works in ethics and technology. So Linda's given a really good overview of human rights approaches that obviously has a bit of a legalistic frame to it. My approach is relevantly different because I work in kind of ethics, both in theory and applied ethics. And just to give a little bit of context, that many of you might be familiar with this, but one way to think of ethics is to think of it as giving reasons for why we think something might be right or wrong, permissible, impermissible, or obligatory. I like to make a bit of a distinction between morality and ethics. If we were walking down the street and someone was, say, setting fire to a cat, we might sit there and go, that's wrong, you shouldn't set fire to the cat. Me as an ethicist, I could then, waste everyone's time by spending hours explaining just why setting fire to a cat is wrong. In this sense, it's probably a little bit too self-deprecating, but I see ethicists a lot like a 4-year-old child who just sits there and constantly asks, but why? But why? But why? So if we think human rights are important, ethicists would go, well, what do you mean by that? Why are human rights important? What are human rights? And, again, we're just like an annoying 4-year-old. My approach to ethics is also quite pluralistic. Linda gave a really nice list of a bunch of different ethical values that are involved in human-centric AI. And as a pluralist, I kind of endorse that approach. I think there's a danger of boiling things down to one simple reason. We lose a whole lot of the detail, and ethics loses its kind of guiding capacity in that sense. But then as a pluralist, we face the challenge of interaction between values. And this is one of the arguments against pluralism. I don't think it's insurmountable, but it shows kind of how things can be complex. So to bring this to human-centric AI, what I thought I'd do is I'd touch on at least one approach to ethics by design in AI, the Sienna project. And then I'm going to look at transparency as one of the values that they see as important, and then show how transparency complicates things. So the Sienna project was a project that was headed by some of my colleagues here at the University of Twente, and it suggested this ethics by design approach to AI. In their research, they presented kind of 6 main values that underpin kind of AI or ethics for AI. They say that there's human agency, privacy and data governance, fairness, well-being, and so this could be understood as individual, social, and/or environmental, accountability and oversight, and finally transparency. And so this tracks pretty similarly to some of the lists that Linda had put forward as well. So there's a lot of agreement in these spaces about, okay, here's a bunch of values that are really important. And so what I want to look at in the time that I've got left today is a quick look at the notion of transparency and how the idea of transparency, I guess, is either evolved or developed in the past 5 to 10 years, and what that means for ethics and human-centric AI. So transparency has been a major focus for technological development in AI. I remember when I first started looking at some of the ethics and AI stuff, it was around 2015, 2016. I was talking with some people, I think they were from Google or something like that, and they were saying how, you've got these AI, particularly certain forms of algorithms, which lack any transparency. They're black boxes. We don't understand how they come out with their results. And it's like, oh, that doesn't make any sense. They explained a little bit of the technology to me, and I was like, oh, that's really interesting. If we can't actually find out how those decisions were come to, or how they came to those decisions, there's a whole lot of ethical issues associated with that. And so a lot of interest, both technologically and I guess in terms of policy and ethics spaces, has been driving towards more transparent AI. But as the technology has developed and allows kind of increased transparency, at least in certain forms, we may find that other values become more important, or the relationships between these values becomes more complicated. So when we think of transparency, I want to make a little bit of a clarification here. I'm thinking of it in a wider sense than just explicability. And so I might be getting some of the, let's say, the technological terminology, I might be using it a little bit idiosyncratically here. But when I think of explicability, that's where I'm thinking about how the algorithm works. That's the black box stuff. Can we explain how this algorithm has come to this result or outcome or output? Transparency, however, is a little bit of a wider thing, at least the way I think of it. Explicability is part of it. But transparency would also include things like information on machine learning libraries, how they were sourced, who sourced them, and perhaps even statements on quality of the data. Is this data reliable? How much credence do we have that this data attracts to the world, and these sorts of things? That would be part of transparency, as in a wider sense than explicability. We can also think of transparency as going to, and this is me being a little bit speculative here, going to known or likely outcomes when you're combining a certain machine learning library and a given algorithm. So if we want to have transparent AI, it would be useful to know, well, how's it actually going to work? What are the likely outcomes of it going to be? And note how this tracks to this value of well-being, individual, social, or environmental. If we want to take that value seriously, we need to have transparent AI, knowing, well, what are the likely outcomes of this AI? And I'm also going to say, this might be pretty plainly obvious, that transparency is necessary for any sensible accountability and oversight. But there's also potential implications for privacy and data governance, fairness, and human agency, the other values that the Sienna project had identified. For instance, with privacy and data governance, there are likely to be privacy AI and a lot of applications of AI are likely to be privacy protecting in terms of if the information that is being used comes from people. Often privacy is concerned when a person is the source of the information. But AI is less likely, or at least it's less clear, how AI will protect people, a person and people as a target of personal information. We've got issues in data governance, issues in ownership and the limits on access to machine learning libraries. Who owns these machine learning libraries? Is it the company? Is it the people who develop them? And or is it the people who provided the information in the first place? A number of people now are, I guess, more critical of companies like Facebook and Twitter, or at least Facebook, who have made billions of dollars off the back of other people's information. There seems to be a bit of an unfairness issue there about the property rights and ownership over that information. So this is pointing to some of the issues that might arise when we have more transparent AI. Who has property rights over that information, and should they have property rights over that? We've got issues in terms of fairness. Should machine learning libraries and or algorithms make their biases known? Again, this is been one of the biggest discussions in and around AI, problems of bias. So should any applications make their biases known in advance? On the one hand, yes, you want to make it clear how this set of technologies might produce unequal or arguably unethical outcomes. But on the other hand, it might mean that people can or will shop around for machine learning libraries and or algorithms that are more likely to produce an outcome that they want. And note here how the well-being and transparency relationship suggests that we need to know these outcomes as much as possible. We might also want to know if a person has bad or risky intentions. So here it's not simply a problem of AI, but things like automation bias, etc., make it more of a worry about how this information will be used, who could be using it, and in what ways would they be using AI. And in a way, transparency can increase the risks of that, because if I'm maliciously motivated and I go, actually, this library and or this algorithm, they're probably going to produce results that suggest, I don't know, people like Adam are seen as the smartest people in the room. I'm going to choose that kind of buy that off the shelf sort of thing. That could then produce a whole bunch of outcomes that favor me in an unequal or unfair way. And then there's a final issue here of human agency, a whole range of human agency issues. But as AI becomes more transparent, we're increasing the responsibility of those designing, developing, using, and procuring AI. When things were opaque, there was problems here, but there was at least some level of plausible deniability. But now that things become more transparent, this assignment of responsibility is going to be shifting somewhat. And this makes me think of some of the dual use challenges. A few years ago, I looked at work on dual use research in biological sciences. And here, this is the worry that when a technology can be used for both good and evil purposes, such as if I was to do research into smallpox, I could then potentially recreate smallpox, and that could be good to help us develop new vaccines, or someone could get that information and use it as a biological weapon. And so the dual use dilemma generally holds that researchers hold some responsibility for the misuse of others arising from their research. And so then the question here is, what is the responsibility for designers and developers who develop an AI product that can likely and easily be used for malicious purposes? So I was thinking one example here would be deepfakes. If you can, if you're developing an AI application that can easily create deepfakes being, maybe it's an actor who's put on Adam's face here and is using Adam's voice, I can convince you that Adam has said these things much more easily than I would have otherwise. If you're developing a product that can really, really easily, provide deepfakes to people, and you anticipate that those deepfakes could be used for malicious or at least socially problematic purposes, what responsibility do you have as a designer, as a developer, and even as a user for the likely negative outcomes of that application? And so this comes back to the transparency stuff again, because as we see more, as we get more understanding of how AI might be used in its applications and contexts, we're probably going to see more potential risks and challenges coming from that. And then we've got this issue of human agency. Who do we hold accountable, and in what ways are they going to be held to account? So that's me done for my talk, and happy to have questions after the final talk. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Adam, thanks very much. And there was a round of applause here, which I'm not sure you heard. Thank you very much. And I'll just turn to our third speaker, Professor Dave Lewis, from the technology or computer science side of things. They're just loading your slides for you.
Thanks, Vinny. And you can hear us okay, Adam? Perfect. Thanks. Grand. So, yeah, so I'm coming at this a little bit more from the technical viewpoint. I spend a lot of my time engaging in international standards. So the organization called JTC1, Joint Technical Committee 1, which is a combination of ISO and IC, two of the big sort of tech standards bodies. And in around sort of 2017, so after this sort of debate, I think on your timeline, it started fairly early on. They resolved that there was going to be a need for standardization around AI, set up a committee. Ireland was actually very active in establishing that committee, and we hosted, I think, the first sort of plenaries every 6 months. The first one was in Beijing, the second one was in Silicon Valley, and the third one was across the road here in Dublin. So we've been very much engaged in that, especially through the Adapt Centre. And Ireland actually provides the convener for there's a number of working groups, the working group on Trustworthy AI, which is where issues of sort of ethics materializes, was originally from Adapt, now doing the same job for a lot more money for Huawei, and still contact with him on a weekly basis. So I want to sort of give a little bit of that context and sort of use that as a framing to say, well, in this world of standardization, which is now sort of coinciding with regulations in this area, and particularly the EU AI Act, how does all of that come together? Which one?
It's that one, I think.
That one, okay.
Yeah, I think so.
Or this one? Am I in the right place?
Maybe it needs to be in...
there we go. So I think the first thing when we do some work here. I'm on a couple of committees that have looked at issues around sort of AI ethics, but it tends to get subsumed in headings, and they get used a bit interchangeably, but trustworthiness or responsible AI are two big headings. And one of the things we established very early on when we were discussing this in the ISO committees is, they were very used to, from a sort of software engineering framing point of view, talking about sort of the qualities of a system. So, issues like, is it transparent? Is it reliable? Is it robust? Adding to that, is it trustworthy? And I think one of the things we brought to that very early on, well, that's sort of insufficient when you're sort of bleeding into these areas of broader ethical concern, because saying that something is trustworthy or not, or transparent or not, actually is a much more specific concern. You have to ask the question, well, who is being trustworthy to whom about what? And so all of these characteristics you actually have to base around that question, which then means you have to start figuring out who the whom's and the who's are. Okay, and in our own work, we break down this in terms of, well, within AI we have a few sort of roles that are fairly well articulated. I mean, there's variations exactly on the legal definitions, but we have people who provide data that are used to develop AI models. So there's people who develop those models. Those models then get put into applications, and those applications get used. Okay, and Oecd pretty much articulates this sort of approach, and we sort of regard this as this is the value chain. People doing that are getting value. They're volunteering, sometimes with more freedom than others, but they're participating in this value chain. But when we come to talk about these issues of ethics, especially when we're trying to sort of standardize them, so we're trying to come up with terms and concepts and processes that can be used within an organization, we need to understand what the societal context is that we're working within. So, where does our value chain sit? And we need to understand what are the sort of the, if you like, the interfaces and standards. We always talk about interoperability and interfaces. So, what are the interfaces between this value chain and society? And, I see this basically there's a couple of places where this occurs. One is typically we work, when we talk about technology and the law, in a sort of a sphere of co-regulation. So there's responsibilities both within companies who are in the value chain and getting commercial benefit or some other organizational benefit, and the people outside of the organization who may oversee it. So oversight has some level of authorities, and there's different models for how those interact with each other. So you can have, obviously hierarchical boards of governors, ethics committees, etc., within organizations. Outside, you can have regulators, parliamentarians, possibly even the press, people who are providing oversight on a technology as it evolves. And on the other side of things, we need to sort of think a little bit more broadly. And you mentioned the ethics canvas. That's one of the things we do there, is trying to sort of engender in people who are on that sort of technological development track to think a little bit more broadly, and sometimes refer to having the moral imagination to think about who can be impacted by your decisions beyond what we usually train them to do, which is focus on the customers. So again, there can be people who could be affected who are inside the value chain, including workers and data subjects, and then people who are outside the value chain who have not volunteered to be involved in this at all, but their lives are affected. You're walking down the road and a Tesla or an auto runs you over, you're affected. So we can use this, and we have been using this as a bit of framing. And then we're interested in what, again, because, standardization, we're interested in what information's exchanged, how do we communicate unambiguously? We're looking at, between the oversight authorities and the people who are affected, what are the signals that are transmitted that engender trust? And also there are interactions which, using a sort of software engineering term of affordances, is what do oversight authorities offer affected stakeholders in things that they can do? Can they complain? Can they sue someone? Can they register a complaint? Etc. So, we use this, when we're looking both in the sort of standards domain, but also looking at that interaction between sort of the technical world where standards lives and the world of regulations and legislation. And we can sort of use this to sort of try and compare a little bit what these different frameworks can do. So this is, I'm not going to go through this, but this is a little bit of our analysis of when you look at the AI Act, how does it overlay onto this model? What are the sort of the concepts and responsibilities of boarding? What are the sort of the modes of communications that are involved there? And, where do things like fundamental rights play a role? And again, I won't go through that in a lot of detail, but one of the things that the AI Act does, and it's really interesting to look at that sort of history of lots of principles that were developed, especially in the EU. They had the high-level expert group, they had their set of principles. But actually, when the AI Act that was sort of going to build on that came out, it sort of mentions it in the preamble, but it doesn't really implement any of that, What it does, it uses an existing legislative framework. So it's called the new legislative framework, which is used for product safety across Europe, which, sets out things like what is the sort of quality mechanisms that should be done. It doesn't set out what those quality mechanisms, but it says you need a standard to tell you what the quality mechanisms is. And I think part of the reason for that is we have a lot of that stuff already for things like medical devices, levels of lead in children's toys and things like that. It's the same mechanism, and they've applied that to AI. And what that allows us to do is then start looking, well, what other standards do we have there? So things like social responsibility standards that starts perhaps breaking down the different type of stakeholders and relationships that an organization does. So the focus goes from the whole system when we go to standards about what should an organization do and how can they do that in a reliable way that could hopefully get some sort of conformance stamp. So we can, we enter a world of standardization where this stuff's well established, being sort of to a level thought through, not specifically for AI, but there's lots of stuff that we reuse. Again, technical people love reusing it, and that includes human rights. So it sort of gets thrown in. And then you start thinking, so how do we do that bit then? And again, that's where in standards we really, technical people really start, sometimes we go and refer to to the EU or it's not the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, but actually this takes this legislative mechanism, which is based around health and safety, into a completely new area that does go into issues of ethics and obviously grounded in fundamental rights. So easier said than done, I would say. I always talk about that they had these three little words, health, safety, and fundamental rights. Simples, and also what's interesting there is this isn't a continuation of establishing principles, because though it talks about it's there to protect fundamental rights, the actual mechanism is checking that you're not contravening any existing regulation that enforces those rights. Okay, so that's the sort of that sort of, if you like, almost like deductive logical reasoning. They say, okay, we have our principles and we'll work it through to a conclusion. You actually don't have the freedom to do that. You're now working in a very, very complex landscape where you've got all these other regulations that suddenly you need to know about, which is very challenging. So I think just to wrap up, we're in this place where suddenly the complexity of what we need to consider goes sort of beyond, sort of an ethical sort of reasoning approach, and we have to look at all of these other legislations that are out there. And I, just sort of flagging really, the way I see this moving. We can see the sort of discussion of ethics in practice in Europe in this regulatory domain is really starting to move towards a question of the legislative gaps, being able to talk about principles and application of them in general is going to stop working, and we're going to have to start looking at these things. I think there's dangers there. It's very complex, both legally and technically, so it very much favours a sort of a legislative, technocratic approach, which is great for big companies because they're good at doing that. They're making claim a bit, but they're very good at doing that. But it does freeze out a lot of other people. Okay, so SMEs are going to struggle. Civil society actors are going to struggle. So I think, given that this is happening, the landscape's sort of changing a bit with this legislation, but we do need to still be looking at these principles and say, well, we're not using them to generate the rules, but we do need to use them to, mobilize the sort of the democratic and the legal and the political processes that we need to do to try and find the problems and overcome that. So, just to wrap up, we see a lot of papers and sessions and conferences that talk about, AI ethics from principles to practice. And I think that isn't a path that could be followed. We're hitting law now and very complex, and we were in an interesting session yesterday, and other conferences like CBDP, very lawyer heavy. Even the lawyers are like, people's heads are spinning about the number of different types of legislation that are interacting about this. So I think a little bit, my wrap up here is, that path from principles to practice, I don't think is going to generate the rules, but actually we should be sort of, diverting that, say, well, we actually need to, leverage that language and actually make sure we're bringing this into the political and democratic sphere. So it's, politicians, citizens, civil society groups who need to be sort of leveraging that with enough of the legal understanding to be able to make their points at these particular gaps as we sort of discover and emerge them. So I think it's getting more complicated, but we still need the principles because we need to have a language that isn't solely technocratic to try and address that. So a little bit of my feeling where things are going here.
Thanks so much, Dave. So we've had three perspectives, very interesting and contrasting in some ways, which is what you want to. I'm going to kick off the conversation with one question, and then I'm going to put over to the floor and for those online to ask questions. Just having been involved in this debate for quite a while, one of the things I've noticed is it's very easy to get stuck in the negative. Oh, it's so complex to this, it's so complex to that, and you end up in that kind of. Whereas, when I look at designers, I kind of say, well, like, what is it about the discussion on the ethics and discussion about understanding that can we bake in early in the design that will enhance our products? So instead of trying to see it as a kind of a constraint at the end of the product line, to see it as an enabler to doing something that's so much better than everyone else. And I think if we kind of think of it in the creative way, so I suppose I'll flip it over to yourselves now and say, if you were discussing with either someone, a developer or an end user who's thinking about what they would like, how will the ethical debate and how will the debate around fairness and trustworthy reshape in the right way for products to be much more better? Much better, more better. Good English, Vinny. Jane. Much better. So I'll throw it to Jane.
Thank you, Vinny. So just a couple of points on that. I think I will answer your question, but the first thing I do want to say is that this is, as Dave has suggested, this is very much a task of politics. So it's about governments, it's about businesses, and having adhering to their responsibilities and duties in terms of the governance of various of our societies in an international context. So the point here is that it is the designers and developers are part of a process, a larger process, and so. That question can't be answered in isolation from the context in which the technologies or products are being deployed. And so I think, for me at least, a lot of the discussion up to now has sort of separated this question of design and development from the political realities of the context in which products or businesses are operating. And so I think the key thing is actually to see them as all of a piece, not to conflate them or merge them, but to see them as all of a piece. So that's the first thing I would want to say about it. The second thing I would want, I suppose the second thing is, in business ethics, there's this sort of mantra that, embedding ethics or ethical considerations in products and processes, etc., in the end makes it more trustworthy. And ethics is good for business is the kind of the cliche. I mean, I would like to believe that, but, my experience over the last 30 years suggests that that's not always the case. I do think that stakeholder and customer confidence in the kind of, broadly speaking, the integrity of the product. And that can have many different elements. It can be about reliability. It can be about, the parameters within which it's developed, etc. All of these are part of the concerns for businesses. And I do think that as citizens think of themselves not only as consumers but also as citizens, then I think these issues of sustainability, of fairness, of equity, safety, etc., become part of the considerations for consumers. So that's sort of my hopeful sort of orientation. But I don't think it's I don't think it's straightforward at all.
Adam, did you?
Yeah, so what I wanted to say was I am equally skeptical as Linda, I think. Like, we can sit here and think of many companies who sit there and present, okay, we've got ethical concerns, and then you look at it in reality, they're still doing a whole bunch of horrible things. That could be in part because they're insincere, or it could be with some of these companies, they're so huge that some parts are engaged in some things, some parts are engaged in other things, and often there's not necessarily a great coherence between them. Bearing that in mind, one thing that I do feel quite optimistic about is I've been working in the kind of ethics and technology space for probably 15, 17 years now, which is kind of worrying. But in that time, public discussions of this idea of building ethics in at the start, or building certain principles in at the start, that's definitely become much more of a mainstream discussion. Obviously, this was going on long before I started hanging around these areas, but early on when I was exposed to notions like ethics by design or value sensitive design, or even privacy by design, these were still a little bit more on theoretical, or even a little bit more kind of on the technological side of things. Like, okay, well, this is something we should do, but you'd have to explain to people what it was, what it meant, and importantly, why it was important, why this is something that you needed to do. This seems to be now a much more common mainstream discussion. So I think that there is, in my optimistic mind, there is a fair bit of movement towards this. And I think that that's having an impact on even things like, as Linda mentioned, kind of empowering consumers to see themselves as more than simply a customer, but, you know, taking into account things like, kind of environmental values, other social values. So I think generally there's a bit of a shift in that direction of building certain principles in at the start, or at least early on, rather than as a band-aid at the end. So I feel optimistic that things are heading in that direction. It's by no means perfect, and there's a lot more work to be done, but I think, I feel that we're heading in the right direction in that way.
Did you want to ask Andrew, or like to go to the book?
I mean, I might say that I think that there's a couple of interesting issues. I think one is, the question is a very sort of computer science question. It's like, how do we get all the engineers to solve this problem? How do we train them to do that? And I think actually it's interesting to see a lot of trends in organisations that they're, specifically what they're doing is not, they are trying to, educate engineers better, but they're also getting other viewpoints and people from other traditions and training into the companies. That's really, really relevant actually for Human Plus and our fellows, because you're all sort of cooking your own paths, and I think what's interesting, it isn't an established path. Everybody's doing it down a different route. It's very difficult to find people who say, oh yeah, I took this route from my ethics degree to working at Google or whatever. Everybody's different. We had that conversation, I think, Adam, when we were talking to some of our ESRs about it. How did we get up here? Everybody got there by accident at the moment, It's not, and then it's interesting to see the paths they take. How long do people stick at it? There's some really well publicised cases where people got in and then got out again, not always in happy circumstances. So I mean, I think we need to sort of bear that in mind. I think the other thing is we got to be really careful about treating it as a sort of a horizontal engineering problem. And I would say to people, I think we've sort of reached peak horizontal, and now actually what we need are people who understand ethics in education, or ethics in healthcare, or ethics in asylum, and also can build systems with those.
Because I wanted to open up the floor. So, are there any questions from the floor? Just Ken, can you introduce yourself?
So I'm Ken McKenzie. I work in the Human Sciences Studio in the dock in Accenture. I'm just interested in this idea of from principles to politics and the politics of AI. I think what's interesting is, I'm going to use a gross simplification, but politics is effectively a set of laws. And what I'm interested in is, when are laws insufficient? So the idea is that our best working example of where we've used very large numbers that people don't understand, that have had bad outcomes for society, is the last Great Recession, where derivatives were underpinned by mathematical models that people who owned in charge of the banks simply couldn't understand. You would argue regulators couldn't understand it either. What I think it's just a thing that's missing is statistical comprehension. Lawyers are great at saying, lawyers will also say, well, the ethical point is fine, but that's not in the law. So we work with the law. I think what's going to be interesting is, how knowable are these things? And the statistical comprehension of regulators, the statistical comprehension of, what does an expert witness look like in statistics? I mean, there are some examples of them. Oliver Wendell Holmes brought in one. But we don't have lots of good examples of statisticians saying, well, that actually isn't AI, that's just big data. That's just a regression model. I find that the misrepresentation of what's going on means that we're bundling in large number ideas without really parsing what those large numbers mean. And the competence to understand what large numbers isn't ever really being addressed. And we're leaving it, I think, to lawyers and engineers to do stuff when we actually need to think about mathematical literacy. Just one last point on that. Some of the scientific advisors said it was interesting when they were briefing senior government officials in a range of jurisdictions on the difference between logarithmic and arithmetic growth. You're literally going back to school. Most politicians, unless they will not understand that. That's fascinating. If they don't understand arithmetic versus logarithmic, how are they going to understand machine learning models and training libraries?
That was a good point.
I mean, I think there is, I think we're sort of established that, we need to start engaging with this, because I think if it's left to a very sort of technocratic, I mean, it's the thing I, personally worry about a lot. I'm in standards bodies. There is one or two ethicists, who are employed by actually very large multinationals. Very few other voices, so actually very, very few stakeholder voices, because they can't afford to go to the meetings on a regular basis and do all the travel and things. But we've, been handed under the current EU scheme a lot of rule-making authority with very little oversight. There's national body voting, but they're all, all the people in the national bodies are all the same sort of guys, mostly guys as well, who are looking at it. There's a representation element, but there is also parallel to that. There is a communication aspect. And I don't know if there are very easy approaches. I think, I always think it should, people should be thinking we do this a little bit and adapt. Okay, we get encouraged to communicate with the public. And, so we do a little bit of it, but it's a tiny fraction of what we do. Okay. And I think almost looking at that fraction and saying, well, actually, if you want to get into this game, like 1% of your effort is enough. It needs to be 10%, and put the onus perhaps with a quantification, say, okay, before you develop this AI system, assemble the experts to figure out how to explain it to people who don't have the training that you have. Because I think, we can't let people just sort of, run away with, saying, trust us because we know what we're talking about. Because as you pointed out in that example, they don't necessarily, the complexity is, some people are better at complexity than others, and all corporations are excellent at handling complexity, but still get it wrong, and you need to have multiple eyes on board. So I think there are elements to that, that are important. And you've been working on stuff like that with the SFI as well.
Yeah, just on that, I think you're absolutely right, Dave. The public communication of research is very, very small and slight, but also the focus has been entirely on the outputs, the outcomes. And actually, to your point, people, we never communicate about the nature of research, the elements, the components, if you like, the backroom stuff, the boring stuff. We're all about the bells and whistles. We've created this, we made that. But actually, the things that will generate that kind of literacy is a public understanding of what it takes and what elements go into this product or algorithm, whatever. That's the bit that we don't do, and I think that's something that is very important.
I'm so aware of time, and I have to bring it forward. I'd love to have continue on, but first of all, just like to thank our speakers very much for that. We're having the next Tech Talk will be on the 27th of this month, September, at 1 p.m. It's on avatars and identity in the digital world. We'll have one of our Human+ fellows presenting on that as well. So I would encourage you to come along to that. But from today's perspective, thank you very much for illuminating what is a very complex area, but also identifying that we need to actually do a lot more on it. Thank you so much.